Today we're going to talk about Paul's letter to the Philippians. If you read in the book of Acts, chapter 16, we see how this church got off the ground. It's an incredible story. Paul shows up to Philippi and he goes down to the river and finds a women's Bible study. There's this super rich Jewish lady named Lydia studying the Bible, looking for the Messiah, and Paul leads her to Christ. Well, the next person we meet is the complete opposite. I mean, it's a demon-possessed slave girl. I mean, totally broke, opposite ends of the economical, social spectrum, if you will. And so Paul leads her to Christ. And so she comes to Jesus. And the next person we meet is this just blue collar worker, somewhere in between, not rich, not poor, just your good old boy who's a Roman jailer. And he comes to Christ. And really, these people that in a social setting would make absolutely no sense to be together come together because of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And this church is birthed, probably starting out in Lydia's home. And so now we get to the letter that Paul writes to them. And so at this point, the church has grown. Paul's in prison, and they take up a collection, an offering, like a love offering, and send it to Paul to encourage him and to help him out. And in response, he writes this letter. Thank you. This is great. But also he has some instructions for them, some encouragement for them. And so the first chapter, Paul begins with an awesome poem. And after that, he addresses one of the church's primary concerns. They're wondering, how is this guy doing in prison? I mean, living in a Roman prison wasn't necessarily a walk in the park. And to their surprise, he says, look, God's using my time here. The concept is that the gospel is advancing or pioneering. And you think about like a pioneer, Oregon Trail, going somewhere that you've never been before. The gospel has not infiltrated a lot of the upper Roman authorities, but Paul is physically handcuffed to Roman guards. He's telling them about Jesus. And so the gospel is going into the imperial guards and then beyond that. So it's pioneering, it's advancing to places that it would have never advanced before if Paul hadn't been where he is. And so he's like, look, God's using this time. And at the end of chapter 1, he gives that famous verse where he says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. So he's saying, look, if I get out of prison, it's a good thing because I can continue to serve people. I can continue to encourage people. I can continue to tell people about Jesus. But if I die, then I meet Jesus face to face. So that's awesome too. And so whatever happens, I'm good with it. Well, in chapter 2, we see a lot of gospel application. We see how when we understand the gospel, it should lead us to strive for unity within the church. It should lead us to humility. It should lead us to striving to serve other people. And in verses 6 through 11, there is an incredible poem. I mean, you could just camp out and take copious notes on those verses along, understanding who Jesus is and how Jesus modeled a life, how Jesus lived out the gospel through the way that he lived. Incredible, incredible, incredible stuff. And then the rest of chapter 2 talks about how we should live like Jesus. And when we do that, we're the light of the world. We're like stars in the sky as we show people who Jesus is and how he loves through the way that we live our lives. Well, in chapter 3, this is Paul giving some examples, right? So the end of chapter 2 gives us 2 examples of what it looks like to live like Jesus through Timothy and the guy that actually received and sent the letter to them. All right, so those 2 examples. Then chapter 3, Paul gives a third example of his life. He shows how he is living like Jesus. And when I read chapter 3, it's inspiring. I mean, I read it and I think, yes, like I'm ready to go. And what I love about it is Paul shows that the way that we live our life isn't for acceptance through the things that we can do. Because Paul had a resume of all resumes when it came to religious performance. He's like, but no, the way that we live isn't for God's acceptance through the things we do. It's all from acceptance because of what Jesus has done. So we really see how the gospel is the fuel that leads us to live a life like Jesus. And then in chapter 4, he begins to wrap it up. There's a little bit of drama that he talks about. Then he offers some encouragement where he talks about how how we can be content in all circumstances. And so he looks at the highs of life, the lows of life, the in between, and he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And when he says that, he's not saying that you can do anything as long as you tag Jesus' name on it. I mean, go try to jump off a building and fly. Actually, don't, because through Christ, like you're gonna hit the ground. It's gonna end badly, right? What that verse says is that through Christ, right? You can do all of these things or all of this, which is being content no matter what circumstance you're in. And so Paul encourages them with contentment in life, whether life is great, whether life is bad, or whether life is somewhere in between, which is available to us because of Jesus. And there's this incredible prayer in verses 6 and 7, which talks about how through prayer we can find the peace of God. And so there's a way to rest in the midst of where your life is. I love this letter. I hope you enjoy it as you dive in, and let's keep reading God's word together.